What's up, people? So before I even get started on this one, I want to make it very clear. Although many of the talking points you will find in this video are very similar to stuff that I've been saying over the past few months, I'm actually not sharing my opinion here. Instead, I am sharing the opinion of one Hideki Yasuda, a Toyo Securities analyst, a Japanese game industry expert, a name that is regularly featured not only on Bloomberg.com, but also on every single Nintendo praising website the second he says anything remotely positive about Nintendo or the Switch 2. So you can imagine he's featured on those websites quite a bit this year. But today, absolute silence. Nobody's interested in sharing what was stated this weekend. In his blog on kabutin.jp/news/market news. I'll share a link to that in the description, but you're gonna have to throw it into Google Translate. This gentleman shares a pretty fun piece where he discusses AI technological innovation and if it's a threat to the gaming industry. It's worth a read if you got a few minutes to spare. You get the opinion of somebody that's actually in this stuff rather than a random YouTuber who's just blabbing. Near the end of his blog, there's a segment titled, "Despite the fastest pace ever, profitability worsens for Nintendo's Switch 2. He suggests that Nintendo reported increased sales and profits for the third quarter of the fiscal year, and suggests that the Switch 2 sales fell short of his expectations at 17.37 million units. This might sound confusing to many of you because it feels like millions of years ago at this point. But remember how prior to the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2, so many people out here were trying to push the narrative that the thing was going to sell 6 to 8 million units at launch, and all of the estimates and all of the expectations after the 3.5 million units sold in the first weekend was that same momentum where it doubled the launch of every other console basically was going to carry over due to the high demand, and by the end of the year it'll have doubled what everything else has done in the first year. There were some absurd estimates early on, prior to the Switch 2 fans starting to set lower bars, as well as moving goalposts pretty much every single month along the way, making it seem like every single sale for the Switch 2 has been something worth celebrating. But many of the hype built up for the Nintendo Switch 2 prior to this launch was the high expectations. I discussed manufactured hype quite a bit on this channel, and a lot of it came from headlines from analysts, and how it was interpreted by the fandom. But whatever the case is, this fastest selling console still managed to fall below expectations. It managed to fall below this industry expert's estimates. Now he goes on to suggest that the pace of the adoption of the game console remains the fastest ever. And obviously this is going to be the case through the first 7 months because it's one of the only consoles in history to have a holiday season in its first 7 months with zero supply constraints. As a matter of fact, the only other console to do so was the Game Boy Advance in the USA, and that's why the Game Boy Advance is the only console in history to currently outpace the Switch 2 in the USA. Launching closer to the holidays with no supply constraints means you're by default going to be one of the fastest selling consoles ever. But despite being the fastest selling console, the stock prices fell sharply the day after the results were released. This is where it gets fun because he's going to start saying stuff that I've been saying, but it's going to be coming from him and not from me. So now I'm wondering if we should all just call him a grifter and say that he's the one who's being disingenuous. He believes there are 3 main reasons for this. 2 of these reasons we all know very clearly because nobody will stop talking about them. DRAM prices is the first one, and the risk of being affected by AI technological innovation. Those 2 reasons are constant across the board. They've affected everybody in the tech industry, let alone the gaming industry. And they have been hyper-focused on by every single person in the entire world about why the Nintendo Switch 2 still saw a decline in the stock market despite being the fastest selling console in the first 7 or 8 months. But there was the third talking point that every single expert out there tended to ignore, and those of us that steered into it and discussed it and predicted it prior to the financials even happening were told we were manipulating facts and data and using stock numbers to our advantage. The third reason the stock market collapsed for the Nintendo Switch 2 following the financials that were released despite it being the fastest selling console in history was that the Japanese market is trapped in a structure in which the more Switch 2 hardware is sold, the more losses it incurs. Whoa, does this guy watch my videos or what? The issue is the Switch 2's revenue structure in the Japanese market. The Switch 2's strong sales in Japan are actually worsening its profitability. The Switch 2 is manufactured in Vietnam and elsewhere, with most costs denominated in dollars. A weaker yen increases manufacturing costs converted into Japanese yen. Wait, this next part, this is the part that gets me all giddy. Ready? Furthermore, the industry has adopted the notion that a console needs to be cheap to sell, leading to a highly strategic price tag of 49,980 yen, tax included, for the Japanese exclusive Switch 2. Whoa, I think my heart just skipped a beat. I love this man. Do you notice he suggested the price was strategic? Do you notice how he said the highly strategic price tag of 49,980 yen, but he didn't include a bullet point below it to discuss how it doesn't matter because the purchasing power in Japan is the same as in the United States? Do you notice how the price of the console actually matters and actually makes a difference because he specifically suggests that consoles need to be cheap to sell, and they're selling in Japan, therefore they must be cheap? And these are not my words, these are the words of a Japanese game analyst. And the funny thing is, I see the word strategic price used in this page. There's another translation over here that says it was competitively priced. I guess it kind of depends on how it's translated. A native Japanese speaker can look at the website and tell me they're for themselves. But it seems like you can't sugarcoat it, and you can't push away the fact that many people view the Nintendo Switch 2 in Japan to be a cheaper console. And that's why it's selling so well in Japan, because it's cheaper. And perhaps if it was that same price worldwide, it also would have sold very well. That seems to be what this individual is indicating. Now here's something else fun that he said. Earlier, he suggested that the 17.37 million sold was below expectations. But then he goes on to say that the Switch 2 sold 4.78 million units in Japan, the fastest rate ever, just under 6 months after its release. This is comparable to the Nintendo DS, which shipped 9.12 million units in its first year after launch. So on a worldwide scale, it performed below estimates. But it seems like in Japan, it's impressing more than expected, which means Japan is the outlier that's massively carrying the momentum of this console. Because if you remove that outlier, or if the Japanese performance was more in line with, something normal and not breaking records, that 17.37 easily could have been another million or two lower. And that would have taken things even further below their pre-launch estimates. But the point is, he goes on to state that the more the console sells, the more the hardware losses accumulate, and it creates a troubling problem. Now, to make things very clear, the Nintendo Switch 2 is not sold at a loss in Japan. Yes, it is cheaper over there, and yes, we are all subsidizing that console. But in the Q&A session following the financial reports on February 6th, uploaded on the Nintendo IR page, in this PDF over here, in one of the questions, President Furukawa was asked about selling consoles at a loss, and in part of that answer, he says, with regard to not selling hardware at a loss, what we are focusing on is profitability on a global basis. There are various external factors such as fluctuations in exchange rates, but looking at the global picture, we have traditionally tried to avoid situations where individual units are sold at a loss as much as possible. They don't sell consoles at a loss. That's a rule for Nintendo. We all know it is. Therefore, the Japanese Switch 2 is profitable. When we see losses for Nintendo and we see a lower financial result, and that's part of the reason why investors are freaking out by it, it's not because Nintendo went into the negative to sell these units. It's because they are not as positive as they would be if they were sold elsewhere. If they make 20 bucks on the Japanese console, they might make $100 elsewhere. Those are just random numbers, but I'm giving you an example. But the point stands. And again, this is coming from a Japanese game industry expert, not from NintenDeen. The Nintendo Switch 2 has fallen below estimates. This is in line with what the president of Nintendo said as well, that the Switch 2 in Western markets has fallen below expectations. And likewise, this is in line with the senior employee at Nintendo told Chris Dring back in the holiday season, where people went ham after Chris Dring, the poor guy, where the senior employee said the holidays for the Nintendo Switch 2 in Western markets were weaker than anticipated. These are their words, not mine. The Switch 2 has fallen below estimates, while at the same time, the Japanese version of the console has overachieved in comparison to everything else in the past. And according to this analyst, it has done so because of the strategic pricing, which means it's cheaper in Japan, therefore it's selling better. And the better it does in Japan, the worse it is for Nintendo as a whole because of that cheaper price. And this is something that I have been suggesting and pushing and talking about since the very beginning, when I was saying that nearly 1/3 of all of the people that want to buy a Nintendo Switch 2 are located in Japan. And that historically has not been a good sign for the long-term success of a Nintendo handheld. And you can see it more in these questions that are asked in the same Q&A session. In question number 2, also considering that hardware sales in Japan are exceeding expectations, do I understand correctly that the sales outside of Japan came short of expectations? President Furukawa answers, as for the volume of hardware sales, you are correct that the sales in Japan exceeded our expectations, while overseas sales were somewhat weaker than expected. This man is not NintenDeen. He's president of Nintendo. These are his words, not mine, and I don't think he's a grifter. But the jury's still out on me, obviously. Question number 3, right after question number 2. Hardware sales in Japan have accounted for a larger than expected proportion of the total hardware sales. Considering that most procurement costs are in US dollars, which obviously they are, it doesn't matter if the yen is weaker in Japan. Globally, investors think in US dollars, and that's why other countries don't get their consoles subsidized. Do I understand correctly that the profitability is declining due to the continuing depreciation of the yen? Also, what is the backdrop to the higher proportion of hardware sales in Japan? Yada yada yada, the backdrop to the hardware sales in Japan trending better than our expectations was the release of Pokemon Legends ZA, Nintendo Switch 2 Edition, and Kirby Air Riders during the holiday season, building on the initial momentum of the Nintendo Switch 2 hardware. We believe that users in Japan saw these titles as an opportunity to translate to the Nintendo Switch 2 at a relatively higher rate compared to Nintendo Switch owners outside of Japan. Oh wow, it turns out that those are actually titles that perform much better in Japan than in the West. Who could have possibly predicted that? The investors in this Q&A session were being very aggressive and really pressing questions about Japan specifically. They showed a concern about how well the console is doing in Japan in comparison to the rest of the world. People with tunnel vision opened up the financials, and the only thing that they thought of was what the number of units that were shipped worldwide was. They didn't care about anything else. But unlike random fanboys online, investors do give a damn about all this stuff. They want to see where the sales are coming from. They want to see what the trajectory looks like. Nintendo is currently only 1.63 million units below its forecast, and they did not see any value in increasing that forecast for this recent financial meeting. That shows a lack in confidence for their expectation. 1.63 million additional sales should be a no-brainer. They easily could have increased it to 20 million, 21 million, and probably would have made those numbers if it was selling decently worldwide. But the reason they haven't is because they overshipped on a worldwide scale outside of Japan for the holiday season. So now, this is my opinion, they overstressed how many consoles were sold back in the November financials in order to generate a bunch of hype leading into the holiday season, in hopes that people would all just line up and buy the Nintendo Switch 2, and they clearly had the retailers fooled into that holiday season where so many of them over-ordered and undersold during that holiday season, and they did so despite price drops worldwide outside of Japan. Unplanned and unexpected discounts because of how poor the sales were. And now with that overshipment in this financial, they are too worried to increase the forecast despite only being 1.63 million units behind their expectations. It shows a lack of confidence in how much they can ship out to the world. And these things are normally discussed and agreed upon with retailers well ahead of time. If they're not increasing the forecast, it's because they know that people do not intend on ordering that much over the next 3 months because they overordered for the holidays. But regardless, one thing is very clear. The Nintendo Switch 2 has fallen below expectations and below estimates of people that work at Nintendo as well as industry experts. And it's done much better in Japan, where the console is priced and subsidized by people that are trying to buy it in the West, where it's too expensive. And these reasons altogether are part of the reason why, despite record-breaking sales in the first 7 or 8 months, the Nintendo shareholder value nosedived after its most recent financials. And that is not my opinion. That is the opinion of the Toyo Securities analysts Hideki Yasuda, a Japanese game industry analyst that is regularly quoted in Bloomberg articles. If you don't trust my analysis, well, at least trust his.